I wrote this letter 3 years ago, before I even knew your name. I just knew someone like you had to be out there. She said it under an April sky the color of washed linen, and for a long moment the wind through the cottonwoods was the only sound in the yard. The pages trembled in her hand, ink faded soft as pressed flowers. Behind her, the first green shoots of the garden they had planted together that morning showed above the dark, turned earth. Rewind 6 weeks. Ethan Callaway was 31 years old, wide-shouldered and weathercut, with sun-lined hazel eyes and hair the color of wet oak swept back beneath a low-crowned brown hat. His jaw carried 3 days of stubble more often than not. He wore the same clothes almost every day. A heavy cream cotton shirt buttoned to the throat, sleeves rolled once. A canvas work vest darkened at the pockets, dark brown wool trousers, worn leather braces, and boots that had crossed the San Juan foothills 3 winters running. He walked with the quiet economy of a man who had learned early that noise did not fix anything. He came down out of the Colorado high country in the last week of March 1889, with $84 in his vest pocket, a broken silver pocket watch he had not been able to bring himself to throw away, and a letter of introduction from a rancher near Silverton that he never once thought to use. He came to the town of Cottonwood Bend because a man in Durango had told him the widow Halloran there needed a fence rebuilt before the thaw, and Ethan had made a habit, over the last 4 years, of going wherever there was quiet work waiting. The widow Halloran was Mairead Halloran, 29 years old, 5'4", small-boned and steady-handed, with dark chestnut hair pinned in a low, neat knot beneath a soft gray shawl. Her eyes were the pale gray-green of river stone, and there was a stillness in her face that people in town read as coldness but was really only the shape grief takes when it has been carried a long time. She wore, most days, a high-necked charcoal wool dress that reached the tops of her boots, long fitted sleeves buttoned at the wrist, a plain white pinafore apron over it when she was working, and a wool shawl the color of wood smoke around her shoulders when the wind came off the range. She had lost her husband, Thomas Halloran, to a river crossing near Pueblo 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1886. She had been 26 years old then. She was 29 now. She had not spoken his name in company for over a year. Ethan rode into her yard on a Tuesday morning in late March, which she noticed. Not a Sunday, when men from the church came around with covered dishes and questions. Not a Saturday, when the traveling smith made his rounds. A Tuesday. He touched the brim of his hat once, without dismounting, and asked if she was Mrs. Halloran. She said she was. He said he was Ethan Callaway, and he had heard she needed a fence. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, without smiling, that she did. He worked 5 days on that fence and did not once come to the house for water. He carried his own canteen. He ate cold biscuits at noon under the cottonwoods at the edge of the property. Sitting on a stump he had cut himself and sat down as if he intended to sit there again. Each evening at sunset, he tied his gray mare to the hitching post outside the small bunkhouse at the far end of the property. The bunkhouse Thomas Halloran had built the summer of their marriage, empty 3 years, its door swelling in the frame, and he swept it out and slept there without a word about arrangement. On the 6th morning, Mairead walked out to the fence line herself and saw that he had not only rebuilt her fence but had also, without asking, replaced the sagging gate at the north pasture and rehung the loose shutter on the west side of the barn. She stood at the corner post with her shawl pulled close and watched him work for a full minute before he noticed her. He straightened, wiped his hands on the front of his vest. She said, "That gate wasn't in our agreement." He said, "No, ma'am, but it needed doing." She looked at the gate a long time. Then she said, "There's coffee at the house, when you're ready." He came at noon. He took his hat off at the door and set it crown down on the bench outside. He drank 2 cups of coffee at her kitchen table and did not ask her a single question about herself. He asked, instead, about the garden. The garden had gone to weeds 2 summers running. She had not been able to bring herself to turn the earth after Thomas died, and by the 2nd spring the seed she and Thomas had saved together in a tin behind the stove had frozen through and lost its life. She had thrown out the tin the previous November, and it had felt like a second funeral. She told him none of that. She only said the garden had gone. He said, "It'll come back if you want it to." She said she did not know if she wanted it to. He nodded once, as if that were a reasonable answer, and asked if there was any more work she needed done before he moved on. There was always more work. The chicken coop needed reshingling. The pump handle at the well had cracked. The kitchen door had dropped on its hinges and had to be lifted every time you closed it. She had been living with all of it for 2 years. He said he would stay through the thaw, if that suited her. He would board in the bunkhouse. He would take his meals wherever she preferred. He named a price so low she almost said no on principle. She said yes. She wrote in her journal that night 3 lines. A man named Ethan Callaway is going to work here until the thaw. He does not talk much. I do not know what to do with that. The month of April came in gray and slow. The San Juan Range still wore snow on its high shoulders, and the creeks came down hard and cold. Ethan reshingled the coop over 3 afternoons in a fine spitting rain, without complaint. He fixed the pump handle with a length of oak he shaped himself on the workbench in the barn, and the new handle was a shade lighter than the old wood of the pump body, so that from a distance the pump looked like a thing being taught a new word. He lifted the kitchen door off its hinges and planed the swollen wood down until it swung true, and when he set it back she opened and closed it 4 times without meaning to, just to feel it move right. She said, later, in her journal, that she had not realized how much of her grief had been living in a door that did not close correctly. She began to leave a plate for him on the bench outside the kitchen door at noon. Bread and cheese and a cold sliced apple. She did not call him in for it. He did not thank her out loud. He would set the empty plate back on the bench, washed, and go back to work. On the 4th day of this arrangement, she added a small jar of preserves. The last of a batch of chokecherry Thomas had helped her put up in the summer of 1885. She had been unable, for 4 years, to open it. She set the jar on the bench beside the plate, and she went inside and she did not watch. When she came out an hour later, the plate was washed and the jar was gone. The next morning she found the empty jar on the bench, rinsed clean, the lid set squarely beside it, the way a man sets down a thing he understands the weight of. She sat down on the porch step and pressed her apron to her mouth and did not, quite, cry. That night she wrote in her journal, for lines, "He ate the chokecherry. He washed the jar. He does not know what it cost me to open the pantry. I think perhaps he does." The town of Cottonwood Bend, being a town, noticed. Old Silas Mercer, who ran the feed store, noticed first, because Ethan came in twice a week for nails and shingle tar and once for a small tin of lamp oil. He sat on the widow's porch without a word. Silas told his wife Ruth, who told her sister Hetty, who ran the post desk out of the general store. Hetty told the Reverend's wife, Della Coombs, whose husband, Reverend Coombs, promptly did not mention it in his sermon and thereby confirmed it. By the 2nd week of April, the town had opinions. Most of the opinions were kind. Old Silas said, over his counter, the widows had a hard 3 years. If a quiet man wants to fix her fence, I don't see the harm. Ruth Mercer said the same, more or less, adding only that she hoped the man could cook, because Mairead Halloran had lost weight this last winter and it was starting to show. Hetty said nothing at all, which for Hetty was a form of blessing. Della Coombs said, at Wednesday quilting, that grief was a private country, and she was not one to draw the map for another woman. There was one dissenting voice. Marcus Whitfield was 34 years old, tall and clean-shaven, the owner of the mercantile and the largest cattle interest in the valley. He wore pressed dark suits and a low-crowned black hat and a silver watch chain across his vest. He had been paying calls on the widow Halloran, respectfully and at proper intervals, for a year and a half. He had brought her, in that time, a bolt of good gray wool, a set of imported teacups, and once a small book of Longfellow he had bought in Pueblo. She had thanked him for each and had never asked him in past the parlor. He was not a bad man. He was a patient man who believed patience was a strategy. He came out to the Halloran place on the 3rd Sunday of April in a polished buckboard, with a covered basket from his own kitchen, and found Ethan Callaway on the west side of the barn setting a new hinge on the tackroom door. The 2 men looked at each other for a long, quiet moment. Marcus Whitfield said evenly, "You're new." Ethan said, passing through. Marcus looked at the fresh plain door and the mended fence beyond and the swept-out bunkhouse in the distance, and he did not say what he was thinking. He said only, "Fair enough." He went in for his half-hour with Mairead, spoke of the price of beef and the health of her uncle in Pueblo, left the basket on the sideboard and drove out again. He touched the brim of his hat to Ethan on the way past. Ethan touched his back. Neither man spoke. That evening at the fence line, when Mairead came out with a tin cup of coffee for Ethan, she said, "Marcus Whitfield is a good man." Ethan said, "I don't doubt it, ma'am." She said, "He's been kind to me." Ethan said, "That's a mercy." She stood there a while holding the cup. Then she said, "You didn't ask about him." He said, "It's not my business, ma'am." She said quietly, "I don't know if that's true." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had not let himself look in 3 weeks. His hazel eyes went soft at the edges. He said, "Then it's whatever you want it to be, Mrs. Halloran. I only came for the fence." She handed him the coffee and walked back to the house without another word, and he stood at the fence with the tin cup warming his palm and watched her go, and grief for something he had not yet lost moved through him like weather. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. The next morning she came out to the barn while he was oiling the hinge on the tackroom door, and she said, without preamble, "I want to plant the garden again." He said, "All right." She said, "I don't have the seed. Thomas and I kept it in a tin. I threw the tin out." He said, "There's a woman in Durango sells starts. I can ride down Saturday." She said, "That's a 2-day ride." He said, "It's a day and a half if I go through the pass." She said, "The pass isn't safe till May." He looked at her. He said, "It'll be safe enough." She did not argue. She only said, "I'll pack you food." He rode out at first light Saturday morning with $43 of her money and a list of 6 things in his vest pocket: tomato, bean, squash, carrot, onion, and, at the bottom in her hand, one word underlined twice, marigold. He was gone 3 days. On the second night, the pass came down in a late storm, and he slept sitting up against a rock face with the mare's warmth at his back. And he thought about the widow Halloran's hands, the way she had held them together on the kitchen table when she said the word garden, and he did not sleep much. He came back on Monday afternoon, coat white with snowmelt, saddlebags heavy with cheesecloth-wrapped starts and paper packets of seed. He rode into the yard and dismounted and untied the saddlebags without a word, and Mairead came out onto the porch in her charcoal dress and her wood-smoke shawl and stood there with one hand on the porch post and did not say anything for a full minute. Then she said, "You made it." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "The pass." He said, "It's open, more or less." She said, "Ethan." She had not called him by his given name before. He looked up sharply from the saddlebag, and she was looking at him with the shawl slipping a little off her shoulder and the pale gray-green of her eyes gone bright with something she was not going to let all the way out. She said, "Come in and have supper." He came in. He ate stew and cornbread at her table and did not speak for most of it, and when he was done he stood up and washed his own plate and told her he would turn the garden earth in the morning if the ground was soft enough. She said the ground was soft enough. He nodded and went out to the bunkhouse and slept 11 hours. They turned the garden together on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, which she noticed. He broke the earth with a spading fork and she followed after with a hoe, working down the rows, and they did not talk much because they did not need to. The sun came up warm off the eastern range and the cottonwoods along the creek showed their first green haze, and by noon the garden was a clean rectangle of dark, turned earth, 30 feet by 20, ready for planting. At noon they sat on the porch step with bread and cold coffee and looked at the finished plot in silence. She said, after a while, that Thomas had turned the garden the first spring of their marriage in exactly the same order: fork first, hoe after, north to south, and she had not been able to say his name in 3 years and was surprised to find that she could say it now. Ethan did not look at her when she said it. He looked at the garden. He said, "He did good work." She said, "Yes, he did. That was all." But something in the yard sat differently after. They planted after lunch. He knelt at the north end of the row and pressed the seed in with his thumb, and she came along behind him and covered each one and patted the earth flat, and it was the closest they had worked side by side in 6 weeks. Her sleeve brushed his once at the third row, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them acknowledged it. At the end of the last row she straightened, and pressed a hand to the small of her back, and looked out over the garden a long time. Then she said, "Wait here." She went into the house. He waited on his heels at the end of the row with the sun on his shoulders and did not know what to think. She came out again 3 minutes later with a small folded square of paper in her hand. The paper was old. The folds had gone soft. The ink had faded to the color of weak tea. She sat down in the turned earth beside him, in her good charcoal dress, sat down in the dirt beside him, and she held the letter out. She said, "I wrote this 3 years ago, 2 months after Thomas died. I found it last week when I was cleaning out the writing desk. I have been trying to decide since then whether to burn it or hand it to you." He did not take it. He said, "Ma'am," she said, "read it, please." He took it. He unfolded it carefully. Her handwriting was smaller than he had expected, and neat, the way a schoolteacher's would be, and the ink had feathered a little at the edges from the years in the desk. He read it twice. He folded it back along its old creases and did not look at her for a long moment. When he did look at her, his hazel eyes were wet at the corners and he did not look away. She said quietly, "I wrote this letter 3 years ago before I even knew your name. I just knew someone like you had to be out there." He did not say anything. He could not. She said, "I was not going to give it to Marcus Whitfield. I want you to know that. I was going to burn it and marry him anyway, because he is a good man and I am 29 years old and I am tired of the quiet in that house. I would have been kind to him. He would have been kind to me, and I would have lied every day of the rest of my life." He said finally, "Mairead." She said, "That's the first time you've said my name." He said, "I know." They sat there in the turned earth for a long time. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere down along the creek a killdeer called twice and went quiet. He held the letter in both hands the way a man holds something he has been asked to carry. Then he said, "I have to tell you something." She said, "All right." He said, "I had a wife. Her name was Sarah. We were married 4 years. She died in childbirth in the fall of 1885, and the child with her. That is why I have been walking around this country for 4 years fixing other people's fences. I did not think I would ever sit down again." She said, "Ethan." He said, "I am telling you because you gave me this letter, and I am not going to take it under a false name. I have grief in me the same as you have grief in you. If you want me to go, I will go." She said, "I do not want you to go." He said, "Then I will not go." She said, "Then say it." He said, "I will not go." She reached out and took his hand where it was resting on his knee, and she held it the way a person holds a thing they are not going to lose again. Her hand was small and cool against his palm. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. They walked back to the house together at dusk without saying much. He did not sleep in the bunkhouse that night, but he did not sleep in the house either. He slept, at his own choosing, on the porch bench under a wool blanket, because he was a man who believed a thing worth doing was worth doing correctly and in order. In the morning she brought him coffee and did not say a word about where he had slept, and he thanked her, and they went out to the garden together to check on the seed. It was the second week of April 1889. The garden was in. The fence was standing. And the town of Cottonwood Bend was about to find out. Marcus Whitfield came out on the last Sunday of April in his polished buckboard, with a small velvet box in his vest pocket. He had brought her, this time, a length of pale blue silk from a shipment out of Denver. He had been thinking for a month about what he would say. He had rehearsed it on the drive out. He did not get to say it. He found Mairead Halloran on the porch bench with Ethan Callaway beside her, and a shared cup of coffee between them, and the garden green with new shoots behind them. He stopped his team at the gate and got down slowly and walked up the path with the box still in his pocket. He looked at Mairead. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he looked at Mairead again. He said, "I see." Mairead stood. She said, "Marcus, I owe you an honest word." He raised one hand gently. He said, "You do not owe me anything, Mrs. Halloran. A man who thinks he is owed is a man who has not been listening." He looked out at the garden a long moment. There was, on his face, something that was not anger and was not quite defeat. It was the look of a man setting down a hope he had carried for a year and a half, and setting it down the way a gentleman sets down a hat. He said, "I want to say one thing and then I will go. I have known you a long time. I have wanted, for a year and a half, to be the man who made you smile again. It is not going to be me." That is a hard thing to say out loud, and I would like the credit for saying it out loud. Mairead's eyes were wet. She said, "You have the credit." He nodded once. He turned to Ethan. He said, "Callaway." Ethan stood. He said, "Sir." Marcus said, "You be good to her." Ethan said, "Every day." Marcus was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "I would like to say, since we are being honest men on a porch, that I do not accept this easily. I have a house in town with a room in it I furnished for her. I bought a small writing desk last October for a window that faces east, because she told me once at Christmas that she wrote her best letters in morning light. I did not tell her about the desk. I was going to. I am telling you both now so that when I ride out I will not be riding out with anything left unsaid." Mairead's hand came up to her mouth. Marcus said evenly, "But I have been listening. And a man who has been listening does not force his own weather on another man's spring." He touched the brim of his hat to Mairead. He said, "Ma'am." He walked back down the path, got up on his buckboard, and drove out. He did not look back. He was a good man, and he had been listening. Mairead sat down on the bench again and put her face in her hands, and Ethan sat beside her and did not touch her, only waited, and after a while she lifted her face and wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and looked out at the garden and said, "I did not know it would cost him that much." Ethan said, "It costs everyone something when a story ends the right way for somebody else." She looked at him. She said, "You talk more than you did in March." He said, "You bring it out of me." They were married in the last week of May, in the small white church at the end of Cottonwood Bend's Main Street, on a morning when the range was greened up and the creeks had gone clear. Reverend Coombs read the vows. De la Coombs cried. Old Silas Mercer gave Mairead away in place of the uncle in Pueblo, who could not travel. Hetty from the post desk brought a pie. Ruth Mercer brought 2. Marcus Whitfield sent a note of congratulations and a small check to the church poor box in Mairead's name, and did not attend, and everyone in town silently understood and respected it. Mairead wore, that day, a high-necked ivory wool dress her mother had worn 30 years earlier, long-sleeved, buttoned at the wrist, the hem brushing the toes of her boots. She wore her mother's small pearl earrings and her mother's shawl of soft cream wool around her shoulders. She looked, Ruth Mercer said later at the reception, like a woman who had walked out of a long winter into her own front yard. Ethan wore a clean cream shirt and his one dark wool coat and the same brown wool trousers. He had shaved. His hazel eyes did not leave her the entire ceremony. That night, on the porch of the house Thomas Halloran had built, Ethan gave Mairead a small gift. It was a length of oak, hand-planed smooth, the size of her palm. On one side, in careful chisel work, he had cut a single word. She turned it in her hand a long time before she read it. The word was east. She said, "What is this?" He said, "I'm going to build you a window on the east wall of the parlor, so you'll have good light in the morning. I've been thinking about it since April." She held the oak against her chest. She said, "Ethan Callaway." He said, "Mairead Callaway. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east." A year passed. Then another. By the spring of 1891, the garden had gone from a 30 by 20 rectangle to something closer to half an acre, with a low split-rail fence Ethan had built to keep the rabbits out and a bench at the south end where Mairead sat sometimes in the evenings with a cup of tea. The east-facing parlor window was hung with a length of pale muslin that filtered the morning sun into the room where Mairead did her mending. The bunkhouse at the far end of the property had been fitted out as a workshop, and Ethan spent his winter afternoons there planing wood for whatever the house needed next. They did not have a child that first year or the second. Grief has its own weather. But there was a child in time. A small girl born on a June morning in 1892. Dark chestnut hair like her mother's, hazel eyes like her father's, named Sarah after the wife Ethan had lost and could now finally speak of out loud. Mairead had chosen the name herself. Ethan had wept when she said it, the way a man weeps who has been carrying grief a long time and is finally allowed to set it down beside someone who understands the weight. The letter Mairead had written in the second month of her widowhood, 3 years before she knew Ethan Callaway existed, and had handed to him in the turned earth of the garden on that Tuesday in April, sat folded in the top drawer of the writing desk in the parlor, beneath the east-facing window in the morning light. Now and then, on a quiet afternoon, Mairead would take it out and read it and put it back. She did not read it because she needed the reminder. She read it because a letter that has waited 3 years to be delivered deserves, once in a while, to be visited. On a spring morning in the second week of April 1893, 4 years, almost to the day, from the morning Ethan had first ridden into her yard on a Tuesday, Mairead stood at the porch rail with a cup of coffee in her hand and watched her husband turn the earth of the season's garden with a spading fork, their daughter, not yet one, watching from a blanket on the grass. The cottonwoods along the creek were greening. The San Juan Range still wore snow on its high shoulders. The wind moved warm off the eastern light. She said quietly to no one but the morning, "I wrote this letter 3 years ago, before I even knew your name. I just knew someone like you had to be out there." She was 33 years old. He was 35. The garden was in. If you are watching this tonight, and there is a letter in a drawer somewhere that you wrote to a person you had not yet met, a letter you have been half ashamed of or half afraid of or told yourself was foolish, I would like you to hear this. That letter was not foolish. That letter was a promise you made to yourself about the kind of person you were going to be brave enough to recognize when they finally walked into your yard on a Tuesday morning, quiet and weathercut and asking about a fence. Love, real love, the kind that lasts, does not always announce itself. It shows up in worn boots and mended gates and a length of oak with the word East cut into it. It shows up in the person who fixes what is broken without being asked, and stays through the thaw, and rides 3 days through a closed pass because you underlined one word on a list. And when it shows up, you will know it because it will look exactly like the letter you wrote 3 years ago to no one at all. So do not burn the letter. Put it back in the drawer. Someone like you is out there, quiet, competent, humble, walking the country on a Tuesday, asking about a fence. And one April morning, in the second week of the month, you are going to hand them the letter, and they are going to read it twice, and they are not going to look away. Thank you for spending this hour with me tonight. Thank you for sitting quiet with these people and this garden and this letter the way you would sit quiet with your own. If the story mended something in you the way Ethan mended that gate, without asking, without announcement, just because it needed doing, then it has done its work. Until next time, keep riding. If you like this story, stay with me for the next one. The tale of the traveling blacksmith who rode into a snowbound town with a broken locket around his neck, and the seamstress who recognized the face inside it. That story is waiting for you.